just hit that. This issue of men and men's characteristics and women's characteristics. And you never know exactly whether Mill is simply playing devil's advocate and when he's actually serious in a way about these things. Because you know that oftentimes his strategy is to take what most people think or stereotype, something like that, and say, okay, given that, we'll assume that, and even though we assume that, I can still prove that we should treat women differently. But sometimes he sounds like he might actually agree with some of these stereotypes, and it's kind of hard to tell here, but this is one area where at least it's a little vague whether he's playing devil's advocate or whether he's actually accepting and believing these distinctions. The distinction he makes is he says men are, as I said before, general abstract thinkers. They're more likely to be theoretical, and so they excel in philosophy and science and things like that. And that women are more practical and more about application, right? So I don't think I read this last time. Up at the top of page 682, he says, men who have been much taught are apt to be deficient in the sense of present fact. Okay, so the more educated they are, the more deficient they are in sense of present fact, what's in front of them. They do not see in the facts which they are called upon to deal with what is really there, but what they have been taught to expect. Does that make sense? I mean, not. Let's just forget about men for a second and just deal with the phenomenon of having this theory in your mind, and so it conditions you to see the world in a certain way, and you're less likely to actually see what's right in front of you. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Okay. Becca, you're.
Yeah, I think so. I was trying to think of an example.
Process it real quick.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, in political science, we use the term paradigms. Okay. There's certain paradigms and they're lenses through which we look at political behavior. And so, rational choice is still kind of the predominant paradigm. In political science, the idea that you can predict that people will make decisions based on their self-interest. And then you can play out rational games even as a result of those assumptions. So if you see irrational behavior in people, or what's really irrational behavior, you might look at that and try to find some rational reason, and you might even not recognize the irrationality, okay? In everyday life, the psychology has taught us this happens all the time. People will behave in a way that is unpredicted, and the subjects won't even see the different behavior. Like I've seen experiments where you walk by somebody at a table who's selling stuff, and then they find a way to switch this person out. Something passes by, and the other person comes in, it's a different person. And people are asked, is this the same guy? And they go, I think so. And they were looking right at him, and they can't remember, they can't tell because they expect it was the same person. They don't notice any difference. So the human mind works this way quite a bit, And he's saying that men are more likely to be unobservant of the details around them because they are theoretical in their way of thinking. Okay? And I know this is a touchy subject in a way, but
stereotypically it kind of makes sense. Are these pants blue or black? They look black to me,
Yeah.
kind of thing.
Right? Or what does it matter, as
Yeah.
a matter of fact? I get that response from my son and other men. Is, when you ask them something like that, they're like, who the hell cares? So that's, maybe, I don't know how you feel about it, but it's maybe something that we have actually experienced some of, but And he's saying the more educated they are and the more they're steeped in theory, the more likely this is to be. And it can be a strength because it takes that kind of theoretical focus to accomplish certain things, especially in science and philosophy. But it's also a weakness because they can't then take what they think and directly apply it very well in the real world, because they'd run up against all of these differences and details and obstacles that they would have to adjust to. He says to discover general principles belongs to the speculative faculty. To discern and discriminate in the particular cases in which they are and are not applicable constitutes the practical talent. And for this, women, as they now are, have a particular aptitude. Okay? And I like that. He says, as they now are, because he's acknowledging there that perhaps if there is a difference between the two, it's caused by their historical development. So women have been trained to take care of particulars, and through their taking care of their family and their needs, especially their children. As a parent, I can tell you that when kids are little, you come to be able to figure out what they need before they even try to say anything. Back when they're young, of course, they can't say anything. Just a certain look, and then you start to be aware of a pattern, the time of day when certain things happen, and you anticipate that. And of course, if you go too far along those lines, you create a kid that's overly dependent, truly. You have to let the kid try to at least articulate his or her needs. Some parents are so anticipatory that they just wrap the kid up in a little bubble, right? So it's quite possible to do that, and then that at this time it was very likely that a woman was going to try to do that with her husband, to please her husband, to anticipate his needs and his wants and what he liked, and to try to make his home the right way and so forth, all based on observations that aren't really even articulated necessarily, just observations about people's reactions. I'm sure you've heard the old claim that women make more eye contact than men, right? No?
Yeah, I think I've heard that before.
Okay. Well, men sometimes get into trouble for not making as much eye contact. Because the general expectation of a lot of teachers is this, that you make eye contact so that you know that the other person is listening and thinking, sort of paying attention, right? And at least in the studies that they've done of early childhood education, they make this claim that young boys don't make that eye contact as much. They're maybe listening, but they're looking at other things. They don't see it as necessary or as necessary. So maybe women develop that eye contact because they need to read people more closely because of the role that they played, in the past, to be able to read men's reactions and children's reactions quickly, so that they could do their role and also protect themselves too.
I wonder if and how that plays into the other kind of common stereotype that women are more passive aggressive than men. Like men will, fight and say exactly what's on their mind. Women will be sneaky and.
Yeah, that might play into that. Yeah, there is a stereotype, and I think that it comes out of past experience. I don't think women are as likely to be that way now, but you can imagine that at a time when they couldn't make any sort of frontal aggressive move to assert themselves. And Mill does make this argument that that's why they have to make these sort of behind the scenes maneuvers to assert themselves and to try to get what they want through, maybe whining and complaining or nagging or pouting or whatever, because they couldn't just make demands, because the consequences of making demands were pretty steep. So yeah, I think it's similar. Men did not have to develop the same social skills as women, if we're buying into this theory, because they were not dependent upon women and they were more independent, so they could develop the way they wanted to. So yeah, he's drawing this out. It's something that everybody kind of thought, but they also thought that therefore men's particular talents were superior to women's in this regard, that it was better to be the scientific mind, to be the theoretical mind, because that orders everything and sort of conducts everything, and it's a lesser role to sort of take care of all the details. But that's where he disagrees and says that they both have their role to play and they're both interdependent, and if we allowed women to have more of a role outside of the home in various enterprises, scientific, philosophic, educational, and so forth, that what you'd find is, at least for the time being, they would fill that role of implementation that the men are not as good at doing. Okay, so it's almost like he envisions women being the administrative branch of the relationship, and that's because when it comes to application, the world is very complex. Kind of reminds me of Edmund Burke's point in his criticism of the French revolutionary theorists, that they think in too abstract terms and one size fits all. But Burke says in the real world, people are so variable and imperfect that if you don't know how to adjust your theory to them, you will hurt them. You will try to, pound the square peg into the round hole, which is what he said the French revolutionaries attempted to do, and a lot of people were hurt in the process. Okay, so there we have, basically the argument that women's nurturing nature is a strength, and that really men and women must work together for the optimal results. Okay?
Here it seems that you can, like in his argument here, it seems like you can infer that there's still going to be an inherent difference.
Yes.
So women still, are only the administrators, and men won't be the administrators.
Yes, at least for the time being. There's that one little wiggle phrase in there where he says, in particular cases which they are and are not applicable. Wait, where is it? What they have been taught to expect. Okay, somewhere in here.
No, I remember that. It just
Yeah.
didn't seem that it was it kind of seemed like a little ad, like, oh, well, just
It's not enough, I grant you that. And the thrust of this seems to accept the difference. And if that's the case, then yeah, he's not going far enough, because he's accepting a difference that he doesn't know is natural or not, right? And as if it was natural, yeah.
It kind of makes her inverse subjection, like when the women become the administrators and the men are just doing like their thing.
Mm-hmm. So isn't that, you're saying that's still subjection?
But well, when I was reading it, it almost seemed like now the women are in control.
Mm.
But maybe there's just.
Oh, well, yeah. He makes that point,
Mm-hmm.
that women are perniciously in control. Is that the
Yeah.
Right, because they are manipulating.
Mm-hmm.
They're manipulating because they have to, and he says it's degrading. So, yeah, I mean, from another vantage point, women have figured out cleverly how to rule, if that's true, much like the Machiavellian advisor. But it's degrading because they can't rule directly. They have to engage in all of these maneuvers when, they could truly be the equals of men. Yeah, but good point, yeah. And I know there's women within the last 50 years who've made this argument that is the superior power to be able to manipulate behind the scenes. There's a book called Fascinating Womanhood from the later part of the 20th century. It was really popular, and it was a reprise of all of the different arts and talents that a woman could develop to make her husband do what she wanted, and to kind of rule the world through husbands. And the argument was that you didn't need to work and you didn't need to do anything other than develop these talents and abilities, and then men would do whatever you wanted. So I remember I had a friend who was in I think a Baptist church, one of those big mega churches, and who invited me frequently to go to that church. And this was a book that they were presenting there, and she gave me a copy, and I read it. And it was like a Machiavellian treatise on how to manipulate your husband.
Really?
Yes, and I thought, wow, where's the love, you know?
Were the men also reading this book, or was it only the women?
I think women were passing it around. And one of the thoughts I had was, would men not be offended at the thought that they're being so manipulated, that what their wives are doing is not out of genuine interest or affection, but out of a desire for power, if they knew. But the way that the book presented it was, this is what men want, and they'll be happy, and you'll be happy. And this is, the way for both of you to get what you want, and for women to rule more or less in the household. And very stereotypical, but surprisingly enough, that was a popular book back in the 80s, I want to say. So not that long ago, and they saw it as a genuine form of power. It was very much anti-feminist, because the feminists then and now will not go there. That's the one thing they won't do. They're for women having power, and we even find that there are so-called difference feminists who say, femininity and family and child rearing can be a woman's strength and it should be respected. But you never see a feminist, I've never seen a feminist go into power through manipulation of men.
Modern day feminists, no, they're not gonna. I don't think they're gonna say it outright, but they'd probably use it just fine.
You think so?
Yeah.
If push came to shove, yeah.
They would say that was justified, I think. I think they would try to make a case if they did do it, they'd be like, well, we can do this because we're so oppressed.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow.
Modern day feminism is kind of scary.
Yeah.
I must admit I haven't delved into it in a while, but it would surprise me if they went all the way to the art of manipulation. You know what I mean? Like how to dress well. This book had how to do your makeup, what clothes to wear, how to act when he comes home from work and stuff like that. Isn't that a little bit too subservient? I know. You should check it out. I think it's still on Amazon.com.
What's it called again?
Fascinating Womanhood.
Fascinating woman.
Yeah, it's pretty hilarious.
Who'd you say wrote this? You said
I
you got
don't
it from a
remember
friend
the
in
author.
a Baptist church.
Yeah.
Do you think it was like a...
I think it was written from a fundamentalist Christian perspective, but I'm not absolutely sure. I know that they were promoting it in that church. Brett, you should read it so that you know what to avoid.
Exactly.
Should be required reading for men at this point. But yeah, I think a few years ago I checked on Amazon to see if it was still available because it popped into my head. And yes, it was still there.
I'm assuming a woman wrote it, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
I know a woman wrote it.
Published this woman's name. Because it sounds like the Good Wives Handbook. You know what I mean? Like from the 50s.
Well, I didn't know
that's what I
about
was
that.
kind of thinking
Yeah.
that maybe it was secretly wrote by a man.
Oh, and put a woman's name on it.
Yeah.
George Eliot did it.
That could be. So, what did you say, handbook?
It was called the Good Wives Handbook or something.
It's what they taught in schools for women.
Yeah.
Okay.
in the 1900s.
I saw it
It's the economics classes and etiquette and how you should present yourself to your husband when
Yes.
he comes home.
Okay, yeah, so it's.
But that was all
really
about being subservient.
Yeah.
There was no.
manipulate.
Yeah.
It was really scary, actually.
Yeah, this was more about, here's your source of power. You
That's
don't
probably
need to
what
work.
it was then.
You do not need to work. You do not need to make your own money. All you have to do is spend your whole day, getting ready to make your husband happy. Just look great and do everything. Make sure everything is perfect.
But would a woman really want to write
But
that,
that is
actually?
the Gold Digger's Handbook, too. I think it was,
That's not surprising. That sounds about right.
yeah, the Beverly Hills moms adults who, don't want to work, they just want to like tan
Mhm.
or whatever.
Mhm.
This is their.
Yeah, that sounds like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. Mm.
That's,
So see, it's still around, but less prevalent. We think, yes. Okay, so let's talk about another criticism that comes out in chapter 3, which is that women are nervous and emotional compared to men, and that this will make it impossible for them to take leadership positions. So they won't be able to be politicians, and they won't be able to fulfill administrative functions because they have this nervous problem. Okay, so first of all, we need to understand what he's really talking about here. What does it mean to be nervous or have a nervous temperament, do you think?
I mean, every time he brought it up in this book, like all I could think of was like, the women that would faint on couches and how that used to be a popular thing because the femininity side, you want to seem delicate,
Right.
is what that seemed to be in it. That almost, like, whenever he brought it up, it was like,
You saw a woman
chances are they're just acting that way.
Yeah, so you're kind of like.
And they're not
taking it
actually
from
like
dramatic,
that. Yeah, like
it-
just
yeah.
over dramatic, over the top,
Mm-hmm.
dumb stuff. They don't actually, it's not real, but they play like it is.
Right, yeah. And
Took kind of a different, like, because I kept thinking of like when some female politician cries versus when a male politician cries. It's really like, oh, how sweet, he's in touch with his emotional side. When like a man cries on like TV.
yeah,
television.
that's
But
true.
when a female cries or like gets upset in any capacity or passionate even, whoa, she's crazy, like calm down. What's
Can
going
she
on?
really handle
Yeah.
the,
Mhm.
foreign policy and the button and everything, yeah.
Mhm.
A woman has to be pretty, like Margaret Thatcher-like, to be able to get people's confidence. But yeah, that's true. It's kind of a double standard because apparently people still worry about whether a woman is too emotional to hang in there and deal with really difficult situations, or is she going to fall apart? We had that concern about women in the military. It's pretty much subsided, but when this was, first starting and it was a big deal, the idea that women could be near a combat zone, there were two concerns. One was that sex would take place and you'd have women getting pregnant, and the other was that women wouldn't be able to handle the emotional strain of being in a combat zone. Well, and then there was the physical, can women actually handle the weight they have to carry and that kind of thing. So I think that's pretty much been put to rest, the emotional side of it. We do have some trouble actually with people getting pregnant, and that's something that's kind of ongoing. How do you deal with that? And the weight issue has pretty much been reconciled. They do carry, as I understand it, a little bit different level of weight. But yeah, I mean, that wasn't that long ago. When did that start? Back in the 90s? When women
94
started?
was the first time.
Okay.
But then they, like last week on NPR, I think they had a story about how women are like now, like it was like an investigative piece on like women on the front lines,
Mhm.
and they did a lot of tests. I think it was must have been the Army.
There was a
Like,
book that came out recently too.
yeah, that's probably what it is. That
Okay.
we're talking about.
Okay.
Do you remember like what?
Oh, something Ashley's War,
Mm-hmm.
something like that, but it was about women on the front lines,
Okay.
like infantry women.
Because technically it's like has been illegal up until this point, but then they went in and it's like, well, actually, there's no front line anymore, so women are still in the same capacity.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think it's funny because a lot of the studies that they've done on like women in the military, like women are actually worse than men at like just emotionally shutting down and being able to just kill.
You mean they can
They
emotionally
can
shut down?
Yeah,
Okay.
a lot easier than men can, and they have a lot less emotional problems with that than men do. Like they've
Interesting.
gone and
That's
done that,
interesting.
and then what else was it? It was women are counted, like women casualties are counted more towards the perception of how bad a war is going
Mm-hmm.
versus male casualties. So if there are like, a huge number of women casualties in a conflict, it's seen as worse than just counting males.
Yeah, that is still the case. I mean, even on the news you hear about, they will point out women and children, number of women and children.
Yeah.
Because there's still this notion that they should not be in harm's way, that, their deaths are more, so,
I find that kind of interesting since, like, I guess that, like, with this older mentality that, women don't need to be doing anything because they're not good enough to be doing anything, but they're still being, like, back in this day, they would definitely have not been allowed to fight or anything like that and
No.
have been protected and sheltered. It just seems kind of, on the one hand, they're seen as useless to society, but on the other, they're still going to protect all
them.
of them.
Yeah. They were seen as, I think ideally how women were seen was this is ideally, but in the chivalric sense, right? So they were protected because they were considered to be sort of the protectors of morality and religion and the family, and so they weren't completely considered useless, but they were considered in a completely different sphere, and it was a lesser sphere, but it was still valuable. If they did what they were supposed to do well, they were the ones that would keep the family together. So, not that completely reconciles the difficulty you're describing here, but they weren't seen as completely, useless, right? They fit that role, and the scary thing for men was if they stepped out of that and intervened in their affairs, that then they wouldn't do those nearly as well, they thought, and they'd abandon their traditional role of being a mother. And you'll notice that Mill really takes pains to kind of dance around this issue of motherhood and to not go too far, and to say, for the most part, they're still going to be doing that and they're still going to fulfill that role, because the fear, it would probably seem almost incomprehensible that women would deviate from that role, and what would happen to the family as a result. But on this issue of anxiety, then we've talked about, I guess, an example that disproves the stereotype. If women are very capable of combat, that certainly would disprove the stereotype. It's a stereotype of long-standing that women are more emotional, and that the emotion gets in the way of their ability to act, not just in a high-pressure situation like combat, but in the boardroom and, in leadership positions. So,
Question to that, and I'm not a doctor, so I don't know if this is legitimate, is like periods. Because it's, the hormones.
your cycles,
right,
yeah.
exactly. And so, like, if you're a man and you're not, like, aware of what time of month it is for women, and she's suddenly getting, like, really emotional, maybe, back then, maybe they obviously don't know as much as maybe you can now.
Yeah.
Like, your temperament changes. Which doesn't mean that you're, unfit to be in a boardroom. It just means that you're going to be a little different for a couple of days.
Yeah, that might be part of the origin of it. There's, people react differently to it, but irritability and grouchiness and a tendency to be a little bit more emotional. And that might be part of the origin of the perception of it. It's something that people can control and handle. You realize that this is happening to you, and you act accordingly, right? When you're a little older anyway, when you're 15, you might not do that too well. But yeah, that might be part of it. And the physical weakness issue itself might be part of it as well. What he does with this, which is basically, I think we're talking about anxiety and emotionalism, right? Basically, he explains it this way. I don't believe he does talk about women's cycles, but he says that it's a product of their being excluded and stifled from actual expression in society. So because they don't get to express themselves and do what they want, there's a constant sense of being limited and controlled, and this makes them anxious. So he blames the situation, and so the upshot would be that if this is taken away, then they would not be so nervous, okay? Then his next argument is that men can also be seen as nervous, that there are nervous men. This isn't the exclusive domain of women, but you find men who are so-called nervous or anxious, and yet they are not excluded from public office and from jobs,
I
okay?
think everybody gets nervous.
Yeah.
I mean, like, why, I don't understand why that they would just assume women are the only ones that get nervous during this time.
I don't know. I think, Deanna has something in there that, whereas men might get nervous but try their very best to cover it up because it's not seen as manly, women were actually encouraged to express that part of themselves.
Yeah, that's true.
So people would see it a lot more because the accentuation on weakness and the need for somebody to help them, was seen as an attractive trait for a woman. So yeah, I think, of course, everybody gets nervous, and it's a matter of perception, whether you see it or not. And also he makes the point that men's nervousness, when it is seen, is perceived differently. So it's, the old Maggie Thatcher versus, Bill Clinton or something like that. Bill Clinton could get away with expressing quite a bit of emotion. Bill Clinton cried. Bill Clinton sounded sad. He was, pretty emotional. He hugged people, and he could get away with it. And people didn't look at that and say, oh, he's nervous or he's got emotional problems. Like you said, they said instead, oh, wow, what a real guy, So he makes the point that we don't exclude men just because they display these traits. I think back then people wouldn't have thought it was neat like we do today. Now we're sort of like, oh, this man can actually express himself. I think back then it would have still been looked upon as not the greatest behavior, but he's saying it wouldn't have meant that they'd be excluded from consideration.
But looking earlier in the man's life today, it's suck it up and be a man when you're a boy. And then
Right.
when you're a man, it's like, oh, that's so nice. You're embracing your emotions, which you should have been doing, like, your little sister was, saying, oh, use your feelings. But then the brothers don't be a man, right?
Yeah, I think men get both messages now, which is
Mhm.
probably really frustrating. I would think that'd be a little bit confusing.
I kind of wonder if that whole stigma that men don't cry was a thing back then, and if that was why it was seen, like how the views kind of shifted today, or like if that was like the origin of where it came from, is that women were the ones that did this over the top emotional stuff, and if you're a man, you don't do that, otherwise you look like a woman, you're weak.
No, that's
And
absolutely
that's
true.
where the perception may have come from, to where today it's like we do teach, well, for the last couple hundred years they've been teaching men, you don't cry, you don't
Yeah.
cry, you don't cry, you want to be a man, you don't want to be a woman, whereas today it's
Right.
like, why did we ever think that?
Yeah. I think that's really true. Women are identified with that, so to be a man, you can't cry, right? And I think we're still raising boys that way, but I really do think we've got this double message that we're sending them, because it's still the case that if your son cries a lot, even now today, if your son's, 10 years old going on the playground and getting hit, knocked down and crying a lot, he's still going to be teased by all the other boys. This has not gone away. It's going to be seen as a major weakness. So you basically tell your son, don't cry. I mean, I did, because I didn't want him to be at a disadvantage in that environment. But then when they get into their 6th, 7th, 8th grade, all the teachers start telling them, to resolve differences, you've got to, have these listening skills, and you have to be able to, develop this sort of feeling
Use
side.
your I statements.
Yeah,
I feel blank, when you blank, please blank.
Oh.
I remember that in grade school.
So then, I think that they learn that they have to do these things to get along, but it doesn't, change that basic proclivity to not show emotion, because frankly, men still look at, am I wrong? Men still look at each other that way, right?
Would you cry in front of his breath?
No.
See, I mean, if you go out drinking and you get into a fight with a bunch of guys, and somebody says something really rude to you, You're not going to cry, are you?
No.
Because what's going to happen if you do?
No.
You could get the shit pounded out of you.
Yeah, pretty much, yeah.
That is still the way it is. That's still the way it is.
Well, and like from my perspective, I think the confusing thing is, at least from my experiences, it seems women want both sides though. They
Mhm.
don't just want one.
Yeah, I think that's.
And I think that's why guys get so confused.
It's
Yeah.
frustrating.
Wait, what do
Yeah.
you mean? On both sides of what?
They want the strong man and then the emotional man at the same time.
Yeah.
But people want that of women. Like, you want to be strong and in touch with your feelings.
I think it's difficult for men. I really do.
I think it's a little bit more, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's very hard.
Because they get a very big dose of you need to man up and be, strong for everybody, and you need to be the take care of things type of person.
Well, at the same
And
time,
then-
considering.
And then the
other
girlfriend
people's
wants,
feelings, being sensitive.
why don't you ever,
Yeah.
yeah. So it's not easy, I think, right now. Women are not, correct me if I'm speaking out of turn, but I don't think women are attracted to a hyper-emotional man,
No.
generally speaking. It's not attractive to this day. So we say we want a man to be touchy-feely, but we won't date that guy.
Well, it's actually, I can't even think of what an emotional man would, I can't even think of that.
Well, I feel like
Like,
I feel like that's actually almost a biological thing, because if a man is too effeminate and he's not strong enough, he doesn't seem like a good
He's not
biological
Uh-huh.
Right.
match.
Yeah. So, but we still want them to communicate with us. Women get frustrated when they can't have a conversation about feelings with a man.
To be fair, I think it's different between like breaking down and crying all the time and being able to like communicate.
Yeah.
True.
Instead of just
Yeah.
being like the stoic.
Okay,
conflict
that's-
resolution.
That's a good distinction. Yeah, right. To be able to actually sit down and talk about feelings is different than just being completely hyper-emotional. But it's still something that men seem to have a hard time doing.
Well, I think it's emotional intelligence. I think women are more emotionally intelligent than men. Like, they can recognize in them, I may be grossly overgeneralizing, but like, a woman like was like, oh, I'm upset. Okay, let's figure out what's wrong. And it's like, okay, I'm just gonna like go for a run, what's whatever, and then not address the problem.
Right. Or, maybe they address the problem by just not thinking about the problem.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think we can get into what he's talking about here. And he just points out that there are many leaders, male leaders, that one could perceive as nervous, but which we perceive their nervousness differently, as in spirited or energetic or, very convicted. Reminds me of, Eleanor Roosevelt, I guess. I've heard recordings of her, but she was a UN ambassador, of course, which was a big deal. A lot of men were really unhappy that Eleanor was the UN ambassador. And she had this way of speaking that was kind of shrill because her voice was high. And she was perceived as very, very nervous. And this was a frequent worry and criticism of her, was that because of this voice, because of how she expressed herself, she was not a suitable person to fill this role. She didn't sound, leaderly enough because of the way she expressed herself. But men can also be quite shrill depending on, their voice and their amplitude. And the last point that he makes is that we do see that different nationalities, again playing into stereotypes, but different nationalities display different levels of emotion. So men in Italy can cry more than a man in England. England is the home of the stiff upper lip, The French, also, he says, are more emotive. I think in one or both of those countries it was, I don't know if it still is, but for a long time it was permissible for men to hold hands walking down the street if they were friends. Okay, that's probably changed now, but I saw that in Italy when I was over there back in the 90s. And at first I thought, gay couples. But I was told, no, that was just, good friends could do that. Or they put their arm around their shoulders and that kind of thing. They're more physically expressive to friends. And we wouldn't accept that here because that's not masculine enough or, yeah.
Unless two women were doing it. Like you see girls walking down linking arms and,
Mhm.
holding hands all the time.
Yeah, that's
Mhm.
true.
Yeah, it's not quite the same, is it? I guess if I saw that, I would probably think first that they were gay, though.
Oh. And maybe it's again a cultural thing. In Mexico, they do that all the time.
Yeah.
And so, like, when I see it here, I'm like, oh, they're friends.
Okay, because you've seen it elsewhere.
Yeah.
Yeah. And maybe it's catching on. But I don't know how far this goes, but his point is that, in other countries, men do it differently. So this is a cultural thing. In England in particular, there's a particular emphasis on this, but men are capable of displaying more emotion in other cultures and are more like what we would call womanly traits. So again, there's no hard and fast rule here. And maybe expressing emotion is not that bad of a thing, so it doesn't disqualify you from achieving things, and that's where he leaves that. Okay.
Kind of wonder how people would react if he would have added in like East Asian civilizations to that, because their males would have looked ultra masculine compared to anybody in Europe at the time.
Yeah, interesting. Now, I don't know what he would, but cultural differences are a big deal when it comes to gender roles, for sure. And so he makes a good point there that you could find all sorts of evidence of that. So next time we get together, we'll cover chapter 4, and then we will do our review on Friday. Oh my gosh, we're getting close to the end.
Wow.
Incredible.
It's kind of scary.